2 people, 1 curse. The rule was simple: don't feel. But some fires don't wait for permission, and some distances only make the burning worse. We are about to hear this story right now. The curse had no name when she first found it. That was the thing about dark magic. The most dangerous varieties arrived without labels, without the courtesy of a title stamped across their surface like a warning on a poison vial. They arrived as anomalies, as statistical irregularities in post-war artifact reports, as a footnote in a classified memo that had been sitting in a restricted archive drawer for 11 weeks, misfiled under structural enchantments, residual. As though whatever had been unleashed in the final hours of the Battle of Hogwarts was merely a problem of architecture. Hermione Granger found it on a Tuesday. She had been at the ministry for 6 months by then, long enough that the atrium no longer felt like borrowed space, long enough that she knew which lifts ran slow and which fireplace in the Floo network left soot on the left shoulder specifically. She worked in magical law enforcement's post-war division, in the sub-department that had no glamorous name: artifact classification and curse containment. It was painstaking work. It was exactly the kind of work she was built for. The slow, methodical unwrapping of things that had been deliberately obscured. The reconstruction of magical intent from physical residue. She was good at it. She was, if she was honest with herself, perhaps the best they had, which was not arrogance so much as simple inventory. The archive where she worked was 3 levels below the ministry's main floor. It smelled of old parchment and preservation spells, a dry, tooth-edged scent that she had come to associate with concentration, with the specific quality of silence that meant something important was about to become clear. The shelves ran floor to ceiling, narrow enough that 2 people moving in opposite directions would have to turn sideways to pass. The lighting was enchanted candlelight, warm and slightly amber, which gave everything the quality of an old photograph. She had been cross-referencing a series of post-battle magical signature reports when she found the memo. It was not addressed to anyone. That was the first irregularity. Ministry memos were always addressed, always stamped with department codes, always initialed by whoever had drafted them. This one was blank at the top, as though whoever had written it had not known who was meant to receive it, or had known and thought better of it. The parchment was slightly warmer than the surrounding files, which was the second irregularity. Dark magic retained thermal traces. She had learned that in her 2nd month here. She unfolded it carefully, using the tip of her wand rather than her fingers, and read it twice before she understood what she was reading. The terminology was dense, the kind of intentional opacity that meant whoever wrote it had not wanted it understood quickly. But she was not quick. She was thorough, which was a different thing entirely, and by the time she had read it a 3rd time with her dictionaries open beside her, and 3 separate reference texts on curse taxonomy pulled from the shelf, she had understood it completely. Amor letalis. That was the phrase used in the memo's single notation, a marginal scrawl, almost illegible, in handwriting she did not recognize. It translated, roughly, from the archaic Latin blend that dark magic practitioners had favored during Voldemort's first rise, to something that made her set the parchment down very carefully and press her hands flat against the table. Love. Lethal. The mechanism, as she reconstructed it over the following 3 hours, was both elegant and horrifying, in the way that only something designed with genuine malice could be. The curse had been embedded in the castle itself during the final siege, not cast by any individual, but triggered by a dark artifact that had been brought inside the walls and shattered in the chaos of battle. Its effect was not immediate. It was patient. It was, in a way, almost clever. If two people who had stood on opposite sides of the wall, whose magical signatures had been encoded into opposing allegiances during the battle itself, developed genuine romantic feeling for one another, the curse activated. Not at the moment of first feeling. Later, once the feeling had taken root deeply enough that the magical signature of the person had begun to alter in response, the way a compass needle slowly, irreversibly turns. Once the alteration reached a measurable threshold, the curse began. She sat with that for a long moment. Then she pulled out a fresh sheet of parchment and began to write everything down, because that was what she did when something frightened her. She documented it, organized it, made it into a system she could navigate. The symptoms, as she reconstructed them from the fragmented notes, progressed in stages. First, a pressure behind the sternum, dull, intermittent, easily attributed to something else. Second, sensory erosion, a gradual graying of perception, colors losing saturation, food losing complexity of taste, sleep becoming a thin and unsatisfying approximation of rest. Third, fever, unresponsive to standard magical treatment. Fourth, and here the memo's language became suddenly, starkly plain, as though the author had abandoned obfuscation in the face of what they were recording. Cardiac magical arrest. 4 confirmed deaths, the notation said. 2 additional cases in progress, status unknown. She did not sleep well that night. The following morning, she filed a full report with her department head, flagged the memo as priority classification, and requested access to the ministry's full post-battle artifact registry. She was efficient about it. She was professional. She sat at her desk in the amber-lit archive and worked through every related file with the focused precision of someone building a case. And she did not think about the warmth of the parchment under her fingertips, or the fact that she had felt, sometime around 3 in the morning, while rereading her own notes, a faint and distant pressure behind her sternum. Stress, she had told herself. She was under considerable stress. She worked 70 hours a week in a basement surrounded by dark magic residue, and she had not taken a day off since the Christmas break, and stress manifested in physical symptoms all the time. That was not magical theory. That was basic medical fact, wizard and muggle alike. She had believed herself completely. She believed herself right up until the moment she turned the corner into the restricted section of the archive on Wednesday morning and found Draco Malfoy standing at the far end of the room. He was reading something. That was the first thing she registered. Not his face, not the fact of him, but the particular quality of stillness he had while reading. The way he held the page slightly too far from his face, as though he had spent so long pretending not to care about things that his body had learned to perform indifference, even in private. He had not heard her come in. The archive was thick with silencing spells in sections, and she had moved without thinking about it, and so she had 3 full seconds of watching him before he turned. He looked different. That was not a remarkable observation. Everyone looked different now, 8 months after the end of it. But the way Draco Malfoy looked different was specific, in a way she found herself cataloguing before she could stop herself. The angles of his face had sharpened, the way all of them had sharpened, as though the war had carved away whatever softness the years before it had allowed. He was dressed plainly, no robes with family insignia, no performance of the Malfoy name. Dark trousers, a grey shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbow in the way of someone who had been working for several hours already. There was a fading mark along his left forearm that she did not look at directly. He saw her. The stillness changed quality entirely. It went from the stillness of private concentration to something much more deliberate. A held breath made physical. A decision not to react made visible in the very effort of its concealment. His jaw tightened, just slightly. The page in his hand lowered by perhaps 3 centimeters. "Granger," he said. His voice was the same. That was the thing that surprised her most, although she would not have been able to articulate why. She had expected something to have changed in it. Some quality of the boy she remembered to have been replaced by something she could more easily categorize. But it was the same. Cool, precise, carrying the particular flat affect of someone who had trained themselves out of letting their voice move too much in any direction. "Malfoy," she said. She was proud of her own voice in that moment. It was steady. It held. She had known he was doing court-mandated work for the ministry. That information was technically public record, part of the Wizengamot's post-war reparations program, by which those who had cooperated with the prosecution in exchange for conditional freedom were assigned to ministry restoration projects. She had known it in the abstract, the way you know things that live in documents and have not yet acquired faces. She had not known his assignment had brought him here, to this archive, to this specific subsection of restricted files. She would have preferred a memo. "You're here for the reparations documentation," she said. It was not a question. She moved toward her own desk at the opposite end of the room, keeping the central shelving unit between them, and set her bag down with more precision than was strictly necessary. "Evidently," he said. He had turned back to his page. She noticed, and she would not have said she was watching him closely enough to notice this, and yet that he had not actually looked at the page since he turned back to it. His eyes were fixed on a point somewhere past the text. "I wasn't informed," she said. "I wasn't asked to inform you." She pulled out her current file and opened it. The parchment made its soft, familiar sound. "How long has your assignment been in this archive?" A pause, brief but measurable. 3 weeks. She absorbed this. 3 weeks of him being in this building, this department, this room, and no one had thought to mention it to her. She filed that omission away for later, when she would be somewhere she could be irritated about it without an audience. "Fine," she said. "We'll work around each other." "I've been managing that without your input for 3 weeks already," he said. "I don't anticipate the methodology changing." She did not respond to that. She bent over her file and began to read, and she was very careful about the steadiness of her breathing, and she did not look up, and she worked with the focused discipline of someone who is extremely good at not noticing things they have already noticed. The pressure behind her sternum returned at 10:30. It was sharper than it had been at 3 in the morning. Not painful, not quite, but present in the way that a sound just below the threshold of hearing is present. Felt rather than perceived, registering somewhere below conscious thought. She pressed 2 fingers against her ribs, lightly through the fabric of her robes, and breathed out slowly. Stress, she told herself again. But her eyes moved, without her permission, to the end of the room where Draco Malfoy stood with his back to her, his shoulders carrying some weight that was not in the files he was reading. The fading winter light from the single high window falling across him in a way that made him look like something that belonged in this archive. Not filed, not classified, but simply present in the way that old things are present, things that have been here long enough that the room has shaped itself around them. She looked back at her file. She turned the page, and the parchment was warm beneath her fingers, and she did not think about what that meant, and she was very, very good at not thinking about things. She believed herself completely. She almost believed herself. The classified file had a burn charm on it. That was how Draco knew it was the one he needed. Ministry bureaucrats hid the things that mattered under layers of bureaucratic tedium, but they always protected what they were genuinely afraid of with something that would destroy it if the wrong person looked too long. He had triggered the charm's perimeter without activating it, which required the kind of precise minimalist wand work that Hogwarts had never officially taught, and that his father had considered a basic social skill. He had read the file in 40 seconds. He had walked out of that particular corridor without looking as though he had been anywhere near it. That had been 5 weeks ago. He had known the name of what was happening to him before Hermione Granger had filed her first report. He had known the mechanism, the staging, the statistical outcome. He had read the 4 case histories, brief, clinical, stripped of the kind of language that would have made them feel like people. And he had stood in the corridor outside the restricted section and pressed his back against the cold stone wall and spent approximately 4 minutes doing something he would never describe as panic, because Malfoys did not panic, but which had shared most of panic's physiological characteristics. Then he had straightened his cuffs, walked back to his assigned desk, continued working. The problem was not the curse itself, or rather, the curse was the problem, but it was a problem he could theoretically manage, because the mechanism was clear and the countermeasure was equally clear. Distance, suppression, the systematic dismantling of whatever was growing in his chest before it reached the threshold that would make it irreversible. He was, by both training and temperament, extraordinarily well equipped for suppression. He had been suppressing things since he was old enough to understand that the Malfoy drawing room was a place where feelings were a liability. The problem was that she was here. She was here every day, at the desk at the opposite end of the archive, bent over her files with that particular quality of concentration that made the air around her feel different, denser somehow, charged with the specific static of a mind working at full capacity. She annotated in 3 different colors of ink, and she muttered to herself sometimes when she thought no one could hear. Half sentences in that rapid, precise cadence of someone thinking faster than language could keep up with. She made tea on the small enchanted burner at the side of the room and always forgot to drink it while it was hot, and then drank it cold without complaint. And he had noticed this on the third day, and had not been able to stop noticing it since. This was the architecture of his problem. He had not expected to notice her. That was the honest accounting of it. He had expected proximity to be manageable because he had spent 6 years at school treating her as an abstraction, a category, a symbol of everything he had been raised to consider beneath him. He had been 17 and cruel and wrong in ways that had taken losing nearly everything to begin to understand the dimensions of. He was not 17 anymore, and she was not an abstraction. She was a person who forgot her tea and remembered everything else. He kept distance between them. He was meticulous about it, about the physical space, yes, but also about the less visible forms of distance. He did not initiate conversation, did not let his eyes settle on her for longer than a glance, did not allow himself to follow the threads of thought that began with observations about the way she held her quill, or the small vertical line that appeared between her brows when she encountered something in a file that contradicted her existing theory. He managed it the way he managed most things he did not want to feel, with absolute surface control and a considerable amount of structural damage underneath. The first symptom had arrived 3 weeks before she walked into the archive and found him there. He had recognized it instantly, the pressure low and central, like a hand pressing from inside. He had catalogued it with the detached precision of someone taking inventory of a wound, present, localized, intermittent. He had not told anyone. There was no one to tell, and even if there had been, telling would have required explanation, and explanation would have required admission, and admission was simply not a mechanism he had available to him. He had adjusted his schedule to avoid the archive during the hours she was most likely to be there. That had worked for 11 days. Then the schedule changed. Some ministry reorganization he had not been informed of in advance, and he had walked into the restricted section at 9:30 on a Wednesday, and she had been already there, at the desk she had clearly established as hers. 3 files opened simultaneously, and a cup of tea steaming untouched at her elbow, and the pressure in his chest had sharpened so suddenly that he had stopped moving for half a second before he recovered. He had turned back to his file. He had not looked at the page. Since then, 4 days now, he had developed a detailed, largely unconscious awareness of where she was in the room at any given moment. Not through watching. Through the specific texture of the air, the slight shift in the archive's ambient sound when she moved between shelves, the way the enchanted candles seemed to burn fractionally warmer when she was working at full concentration. He hated this awareness with a clean, uncomplicated feeling that was one of the few things he currently had that was clean and uncomplicated. On Friday afternoon, the second symptom arrived. He was in his assigned room in the temporary ministry housing, a spare, functional space that he had not personalized in any way, because personalizing it would have implied a relationship with his current circumstances that he was not prepared to have. And he was eating dinner, which was a leek and potato soup from the ministry canteen that was perfectly adequate. And he realized partway through that he could not taste it. Not that it tasted bad, not that the flavor was muted. It was simply absent, as though someone had taken the sensory information and removed it cleanly, leaving the texture and temperature and the mechanical act of eating, but nothing beneath. He put the spoon down, picked it up again, set it down. He sat at his bare table in his spare room and looked at the soup and understood with absolute clarity that the first stage had progressed. He did not sleep that night, not because of distress. He was, by now, practiced at not permitting distress to become insomnia, but because the quality of his awareness had sharpened into something that made rest feel structurally impossible. Every time he was close to unconsciousness, the image that surfaced was not a nightmare, not a memory of anything that had happened in the war, but something smaller and more frightening. The archive in amber candlelight, and the sound of her quill moving, and the cold cup of tea at the edge of her desk growing colder. He lay in the dark of his ministry room and applied himself with rigorous deliberateness to the problem. The clinical reality was this. The cursor had activated at the first stage because the threshold had been crossed. His magical signature had already altered enough, already oriented enough, that the curse had taken it as confirmation of what was happening. Which meant the feeling was not incipient. It was not the beginning of something. It was something that had already been developing, unacknowledged, for long enough that his own magic had restructured itself around it without his permission. He found this deeply irritating. He also found it in the private dark of 4 a.m, in a room with no one to perform composure for, terrifying in a way that was very quiet and very thorough. Because he had read the case histories, he knew what stage 3 looked like. He knew what stage 4 was called. And he knew this was the knowledge that sat heaviest, that the countermeasure required the feeling to be genuinely severed, not merely suppressed. Suppression, it turned out, did not work. He had read that in the file too, a single brutal line near the end. Suppression of emotional response without elimination of underlying attachment accelerates symptomatic progression. The curse, whatever had designed it, was not fooled by performance. It read the magic, not the surface. Which meant that everything he had been doing, every careful avoidance, every maintained distance, every deliberate refusal to let his gaze settle, had been precisely the wrong strategy. He had been feeding it. His own meticulous self-control, applied to the wrong problem, had been making it worse. He stared at the ceiling and thought about that for a long time. The only workable solution, as far as he could reconstruct it, was genuine elimination, which would require either an as-yet undiscovered countercurse or something he had no framework for, because the feelings themselves were not something he knew how to approach as a solvable problem. They were not a puzzle with a correct answer. They were not a legal document with a procedure. They were simply there in the specific architecture of how the archive felt different when she was in it, and he had no tools for that kind of work. He got up at 5 and made tea. He could not taste the tea either. He drank it anyway, standing at the window of his ministry room, watching the pre-dawn dark over London. And he thought about Hermione Granger reading a memo she should not have been able to decode in under 3 hours. And he thought about what happened when she connected the symptom she had likely already dismissed as stress to the file she had spent all week reconstructing. And he thought about the moment she would look at the documented mechanism and understand exactly what it meant. She would figure it out. she always figured everything out. The only question was what she would do with it once she had. He found out at 11:30 on Saturday morning when he arrived at the archive. He had started coming on weekends because the empty building was preferable to his empty room. And she was already there, not working. Standing in the center of the room with a file open in her hands and her back very straight and her face doing the thing it did when she had understood something she wished she hadn't. She looked up when he came in. She did not look away. The file in her hands he recognized from 3 meters away was the one with the burn charm. She had disarmed the charm. Of course she had. She had probably disarmed it without breaking her stride. And she had read it. And she was looking at him now with those precise, serious eyes, and an expression that was not accusation and was not fear, but was something between them that had no clean name, something that looked like the moment before a very important question gets asked. The pressure behind his sternum arrived like a chord struck on an instrument he hadn't known was inside him, resonant and low and impossible to pretend he couldn't hear. He did not move. He held the doorframe's edge with 2 fingers, lightly, the silver of his cufflink catching the candlelight, and he looked back at her and waited for whatever came next. "You already knew," she said. It was not a question. He said nothing, which was itself an answer, and they both understood that. She closed the file with the careful, deliberate motion of someone who needs their hands to be doing something precise, while their mind processes something enormous. She set it on the desk beside her. She looked at him for another long moment, and he watched her work through it. The visible progression of her thought, the small movements of her face that she likely did not know she made. Then she said, very quietly, "How long?" The candlelight moved. Somewhere in the archive's deeper shelves, a draft stirred old parchment, and the sound it made was barely a sound at all, more like the memory of one. He let go of the doorframe. "Long enough," he said. The corridor between the shelves was narrow enough that standing in it felt like a confession. Hermione had not chosen it deliberately. She had simply moved toward the reference section out of habit, the instinct of someone who processes difficult information by finding more of it. And he had followed at a distance that was careful enough to be intentional. And now they were here, in the space between 2 floor-to-ceiling shelves of dark classified files, where the candlelight barely reached, and the air carried that particular density of old magic that made every word feel slightly heavier than it should. She had her arms crossed. She was aware of this, aware that it looked defensive, that it was defensive, that she had arranged herself into this posture without deciding to, because some part of her understood that she needed the pressure of her own hands against her own ribcage right now, needed to feel that the thing behind her sternum was contained, was not visible, was not something he could see from where he stood at the corridor's entrance, with his hands in his pockets and his expression doing that specific thing. It did, where it revealed absolutely nothing, and that very blankness was itself a kind of revelation. "We need to establish what we're dealing with," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she had expected. She was grateful for this in the same way she was grateful for her own competence generally, as a fact, not a comfort. "We're dealing with amor letalis," he said. You've read the file. You know what it does. I know what the file says it does. I also know the file is incomplete. The symptomatic progression is documented, but the activation threshold isn't clearly defined, and there's no indication of how the curse distinguishes between. She stopped, recalibrated. She had been about to say genuine feeling, and the phrase had snagged on something inside her chest that she was not prepared to examine. Between different categories of emotional response. Something moved across his face. It was brief, a fractional shift in the set of his jaw, quickly smoothed. But she had always been observant in ways that inconvenienced her, and she caught it. The curse doesn't make categorical distinctions, he said. The mechanism is binary. Opposing magical signatures, sufficient emotional alteration, activation. You've clearly thought about the mechanism more than the file's notation warrants. I've had more time with the file than you have. 5 weeks more, she said. You knew for 5 weeks and didn't. She caught herself again. Didn't what exactly? He owed her nothing. They were not friends. They were two people assigned to the same archive by the mutual indifference of ministry scheduling, who were apparently, impossibly, catastrophically relevant to each other in the specific way the curse required, and she needed to think about that as a logistical problem rather than as the thing it actually was, which was... Didn't tell you, he finished. His voice was flat. Not unkind, precisely, but without the softening that would have made it easier. No, I didn't. Why? The word came out smaller than she intended. She watched him register this. Watched him decide something, in the way he sometimes did in the archive when she caught him at the edge of her peripheral vision, considering a file with an expression of genuine internal deliberation, as though the choice between two interpretations was a thing that required his full self. Because telling you would have required explaining why it was relevant to you specifically, he said. And that conversation, a pause, almost imperceptible, had implications I wasn't prepared to manage. The candlelight between them wavered. The draft from somewhere in the archive's deeper architecture moved through the corridor, and she felt it against her neck, cool and specific. Well, she said carefully, we're managing them now. Are we? We have to. She uncrossed her arms, consciously, deliberately, because she needed to stop performing defensiveness and start performing competence, and the distinction mattered. The progression is real. I felt the first symptom 2 days ago. You're already at the second stage, which means your timeline is further advanced than mine, which means you've been... She stopped walking through the clinical logic and made herself say the human version of it. You've been feeling this for longer than I have. He said nothing. His hands had come out of his pockets. He stood with them at his sides now, which on him read as a kind of openness, not comfort, but the absence of a specific guard. And she noticed this because she noticed everything about him now, and she hated that with a feeling that was genuine and exhausting. We need a protocol, she said. A protocol, he repeated. The faintest edge of something, not quite amusement, but its structural skeleton. A set of agreed parameters for how we operate while I continue researching a countercurse. Rules. She pulled her wand from her sleeve and turned it once in her fingers, not casting anything, just the familiar motion of something to do with her hands. Distance. Maintained. Contact. Minimized. We continue our assigned work because we don't have the option of leaving, But we do it with... I know what distance looks like, Granger. His voice had not raised. It had done the opposite, dropped into something quieter and more precise. I've been practicing it for 5 weeks. And it hasn't worked, she said. The file specifically states that suppression without elimination accelerates progression. You're at stage 2. Your approach has been counterproductive. The silence that followed had texture to it. She watched his jaw work once, a small, tight movement, and then stop. I'm aware, he said. Then why? Because the alternative to suppression, he said, with the careful enunciation of someone placing words down like objects that might break, is elimination. And elimination requires something I don't have access to. The thing in her chest pressed, just slightly, outward. She understood what he was not saying. She was very good at the subtext of things left unspoken, and what lived beneath his words was the same thing that lived beneath her own reluctance to finish her sentences cleanly. The simple, terrible fact that the cure for this particular curse was not a potion or a counterspell or a clever piece of arithmetic intervention. The cure was the cessation of feeling. And feelings, unlike files, did not respond to systematic dismantling, just because dismantling them was the logical course of action. I know, she said quietly. He looked at her. She had not often been the subject of Draco Malfoy's direct attention. Not like this. Not without the armor of contempt or the performance of indifference between them. The grey of his eyes in the low archive light was not a single colour, but several. Winter slate at the edge, something warmer and less nameable near the centre. And she found herself noting this with the same involuntary precision with which she noted everything else about him. And the pressure in her sternum became, for just a moment, something close to ache. She looked away first. The protocol, she said, and her voice was admirably level. We maintain distance, 3 meters minimum when working in the same space. We don't... She chose her words with the focus of someone diffusing something. We don't discuss this with anyone else. The Ministry's full information on the curse is classified, and if it becomes known that we're affected, there will be interventions that take the decision out of our hands. Agreed, he said immediately. No contact. She said it crisply, clinically. As a rule, not a wound. Physical proximity appears to intensify the symptomatic response, and until I find a solution that addresses the underlying mechanism rather than just managing the surface. Granger. She stopped. The rule you're describing, he said, is the same rule I've been failing to follow for 5 weeks. Dressing it in protocol language doesn't change its structural problems. I'm aware of the structural problems, she said. I'm also aware that we need something to operate inside of, even if it's imperfect, because the alternative is... She stopped again. This time, the unfinished sentence hung in the narrow corridor between them, and they both understood exactly what she hadn't said. The alternative is doing nothing, and the file says what doing nothing leads to. He nodded. Once. The motion was small and contained, the way everything he did was small and contained. And she thought, not for the first time, and with the same reflexive frustration she always felt about it, that it must be exhausting to exist that tightly. Fine, he said. Your protocol. 3 meters, no contact, mutual silence on the matter. Yes, and your research. I'll find something, she said. not a boast, a statement of intent, delivered with the flat certainty of someone who has built their entire life on the premise that problems, if approached with sufficient rigor, yield. Something in his expression shifted. It was not softness. She did not think he had easy access to softness, but it was adjacent to something, a fractional loosening of the architecture he maintained so carefully around himself. "I know you will," he said. The words were simple. They were not delivered with warmth. They were delivered in the same cool, level tone he used for everything. But there was something underneath them that was not performed, something that felt like it had come from a place inside him that the performance didn't usually reach. She recognized it because she had heard it once before, years ago, and in a completely different context, in the voice of someone who had just told her something true by accident. She stepped back, out of the corridor between the shelves, back into the wider space of the archive, where the candlelight was better and 3 meters of air between them was achievable. "We start now," she said. "We started 5 weeks ago," he said. "We were just calling it something else." He moved to his end of the room. She moved to hers. The archive settled around them. Old parchment, preservation spells, the amber warmth of enchanted light. And they worked in silence for the next 3 hours, maintaining the exact prescribed distance, following every term of the protocol they had just agreed. And Hermione turned pages with steady hands and did not look up. And Draco annotated files with meticulous precision and did not look up. And in the sustained, careful quiet between them, something continued to grow with perfect indifference to the rules they had made. At 4 o'clock, she picked up her tea. It was cold. She drank it anyway. From the far end of the room, she heard the soft sound of his quill setting down. Then nothing. Then, very quietly, the sound of him picking it up again and continuing. She stared at the file in front of her and understood, with a specific clarity that came to her when she was solving something important, that the protocol was not going to save either of them. She was going to have to find another way. She turned to a fresh sheet of parchment and wrote at the top, in her smallest and most precise hand, "Amor Letalis, activation mechanism, what the file gets wrong." She underlined it twice, and she began. She broke the rule on a Thursday, not through want. She would maintain that internally with the stubborn precision of someone annotating their own behavior for an audience of one. Not through want, and not through weakness, and not through any failure of the protocol she had constructed with such deliberate architectural care. She broke it through something older and less negotiable than any of those things. She broke it through the specific human inability to walk past someone who is suffering and pretend the walking past is a neutral act. It was 8:30 in the evening. She had stayed late. She always stayed late now because the research had developed an urgency that made leaving feel like abandonment, and because the archive at night had a quality she found conducive to the kind of thinking that required the whole mind rather than just its surface. The ministry building emptied by 6, and by 7, the only sounds were the enchanted lighting adjusting itself and the distant structural murmur of the building's own old magic. And she had come to depend on that particular silence the way she depended on other forms of reliable infrastructure. She had not expected him to still be there. She had gathered her notes at 8:30. She had a system, a specific order in which she closed files and stacked parchment and capped her inkwells, developed over months of working in this room. And she had put on her outer robes and lifted her bag, and she had been 2 steps from the archive's main door when she heard something that was not the building's ambient murmur. It was a breath, carefully controlled, the kind of breath that requires active management. She stopped. The stairwell that connected the archive's main floor to the lower storage level was through a door to her left, a narrow, stone-walled passage that the ambient lighting charms did not fully reach, lit instead by 2 wall-mounted torches that burned with a low and slightly greenish light. The door was ajar. She stood outside it and did not move for 4 full seconds, and in those 4 seconds she conducted an internal argument of considerable ferocity that she lost comprehensively. She pushed the door open. He was on the 3rd step from the bottom, sitting with his back against the wall and his knees drawn up and his arms resting on them with the careful looseness of someone who has positioned themselves for maximum stability. His face was angled away from her. His shirt was damp at the collar. The greenish torchlight made the pallor of him look architectural, like something cut from pale stone and set there, very still, as though stillness was the only available structural option. She had read about the 3rd stage. She had read about it clinically. The fever, unresponsive to standard magical treatment, arriving in episodes rather than continuously, unpredictable in timing and duration. She had read about it as a sequence of words on classified parchment in her careful, analytic way, and she had understood it as a medical fact. She had not understood it as this, as a person on a staircase in a building that had emptied 3 hours ago, managing something alone because alone was the only thing available. "Malfoy," she said. He turned his head. The motion was slower than it should have been, and she noted this with the part of her brain that was always noting things, cataloguing things, building its relentless inventory of the world. "Granger." His voice was level. It cost him something to make it level. She could see that in the slight tension at the hinge of his jaw, the controlled quality of each syllable. "You should go." "I'm not going. The protocol is not applicable to medical emergencies," she said. She said it the way she said most things that she had already decided, not loudly, not aggressively, but with the particular weight of someone who has done the calculation and arrived at an answer and is simply reporting the result. She descended the first 2 steps and stopped there, sitting down on the step above him so that they were close but not touching, separated by the width of 1 stone stair and the space of the air between. He looked at her for a long moment. His eyes in the greenish light were dark and very tired. "I'm managing it," he said. "I know you are," she said. "You can manage it with me here as well as without me." Something in his face did something small and complicated. He looked away. "How long has it been this time?" she asked. "An hour and a half." She absorbed this. An hour and a half, alone in a stairwell because he had not wanted to be seen, because being seen in any kind of diminishment was, for him, a vulnerability that the whole architecture of how he moved through the world was designed to prevent. She understood this in the way she understood things about people she had been watching, involuntarily and against all protocol for months. "Does it help to talk?" she asked. "No," he said. Then, after a moment, "I don't know. I've never tried." She settled her back against the wall. The stone was cold through her robes, and the step beneath her was narrow, and the greenish torchlight was genuinely unflattering. And she was aware that by every term of the agreement they had made in the narrow corridor between the shelves, she should not be here. She was also aware that the pressure behind her own sternum, which had been a consistent and unwelcome companion for days now, was doing something different in this proximity. Not worsening exactly, something more ambiguous, as though being close to him was both the problem and the only available relief from the problem simultaneously, which was the kind of logical paradox she usually found infuriating and was currently finding something else entirely. "Tell me something," she said. "Anything. Something you've been thinking about." He was quiet for a moment. The torches shifted. Somewhere above them, the archive's enchantments made their small, settled sounds. "The case histories," he said finally. "The 4 in the file. What about them?" "They're documented as failures," he said. 4 cases, 4 fatalities. The Ministry's conclusion is that the curse is unsurvivable once activated beyond the first stage. He paused. "But the documentation is incomplete. The case histories don't include the full timeline. There are gaps, redacted sections, notation that references additional files that aren't in the archive." She turned to look at him. The side of his face in the torchlight was angles and shadow, and the particular expression he wore when his mind was working, which she recognized now with the ease of long observation. "You think the file is wrong," she said. "I think the file is partial," he said, "which is a different problem. Wrong implies the information present is inaccurate. Partial implies there's information absent that would change the conclusion." He shifted slightly. She heard the movement more than saw it, the small adjustment of someone whose body is asking for something he's not going to give it. "You've been researching the activation mechanism?" "Yes." "Have you found anything?" She was quiet for a moment. She had found something. A thread, really, not yet a conclusion, a place in the curse's documented logic where the reasoning had a gap in it that she couldn't stop returning to. She had not told anyone because it was too early and too fragile, and she was not in the habit of presenting theories before they were sufficiently armored. But she was in a stairwell at 8:30 with Draco Malfoy, and the torchlight was greenish, and he had been sitting here alone for an hour and a half. And something about the specific quality of this moment made the usual rules about premature disclosure feel less essential. "The mechanism," she said slowly. "The way the file describes it. The curse activates when emotional alteration in the magical signature crosses a certain threshold, when the feeling becomes too established to be removed without intervention." "Yes, but the file doesn't define what it means by established." She turned the thought over as she spoke it, feeling for its edges. "It treats the threshold as a fixed point, as though the curse measures the magnitude of feeling and responds when it gets large enough. But that's not how most sympathetic dark magic operates. Sympathetic curses don't usually respond to magnitude. They respond to..." She stopped, feeling the shape of what she was trying to say clarify. "To orientation, to direction. It's not how much you're feeling, it's what you're doing with it." The stairwell was very quiet. He had turned to look at her. She could feel his attention the way you feel a change in air pressure. Not seen, not heard, but registered by something below the level of ordinary sense. You think the suppression is the mechanism, he said. Not a question. He had followed it immediately, the way he always did when she was working through something real. She had noticed this about him months ago, and had filed it in the place where she put things she found unexpectedly significant. He was quick, not in the showy, surface way of people who wanted to be seen being quick. In the deeper way, the way that meant he was actually tracking the logic rather than performing comprehension. I think the suppression might be what it feeds on, she said. The specific alchemy of feeling something and spending every available resource pretending you don't. Not the feeling itself, but the gap between the feeling and what you allow yourself to acknowledge. She pressed her fingers against her sternum, lightly, without thinking about it. Which would mean everything we've been doing has been making it worse, he said. Yes. The words settled between them. He looked at his hands. His fingers were spread on his knees, very still. The stillness that was not relaxation, but its opposite. The stillness of something held under considerable pressure. Then he said, very quietly, without looking up, that would mean the file's 4 fatalities weren't killed by the curse. Not directly, she said. They were killed by following the ministry's advice. She did not answer immediately, because the answer was yes, and the weight of it was considerable. 4 people who had done everything they were told to do, who had suppressed and distanced and maintained protocol, and the protocol itself had been the mechanism of their deaths. The curse had used their own careful self-management against them. She thought about 5 weeks of Draco Malfoy alone in this building, performing distance with meticulous precision, and something moved in her chest that was not the curse's pressure, but something older and more human and considerably harder to classify. It's a theory, she said. I don't have enough yet to be certain. You have enough, he said. That's not. You have enough, he said again, and looked up. His eyes were steadier than they had been when she first came in. The episode was passing, she thought, the fever retreating by degrees. But there was something in them that the steadiness did not fully cover. Something raw and very tired, and more present than she was accustomed to seeing from him. You've had enough for a while. You're looking for more because finding more delays the moment when the theory becomes the conclusion, and you have to decide what to do with it. The torchlight moved. She felt the stone cold through her robes, and the narrow hardness of the step beneath her, and the warmth of him beside her. The physical heat of the fever he was running. But also something else. Something that had nothing to do with the curse, and everything to do with the fact that he had just described her own interior process back to her with a precision that she usually reserved for herself. She should have been annoyed. She found she wasn't. You're doing the same thing, she said quietly. He held her gaze for a moment that had a specific weight to it, a duration that was not quite comfortable and was something much more important than comfortable. Then he looked away, down at his hands. The silver of his ring caught the greenish light and held it. Yes, he said, simply, without armor. They sat in the stairwell in silence, not the silence of avoidance, but a different kind, The kind that happens when two people have said something true and are letting it settle into the space between them. Above them, the archive waited with its files and its amber light and its old parchment smell. Below them, the lower storage level breathed its colder, deeper air. She did not leave. He did not ask her to. After a while, she said, "I'll have a more complete theory by Monday." "I know," he said. They sat in the green-lit dark of the stairwell and said nothing more, and nothing between them was resolved, and everything between them had changed. And outside the ministry building, London went about its ordinary midnight business, entirely unaware that two people were sitting on a narrow stone staircase, discovering that proximity, which they had been so carefully treating as the danger, might be the only direction in which something like safety existed. The ministry function was called a restoration gala. Someone in the Department of Magical Cooperation had decided, with the specific optimism of people who arrange events rather than attend them, that 8 months after the end of a war was exactly the right moment for enchanted centerpieces and a string quartet and a receiving line in the atrium, where the golden statue had been replaced by something newer and more aspirational. The invitation had arrived on Hermione's desk with the particular authority of things that are technically optional and functionally mandatory, and she had looked at it for a long moment before setting it to one side and returning to her research. She had gone anyway. Of course she had gone. Harry had owled her twice, and Ginny a third time, and she understood that her presence at these things was not entirely about her own comfort, but about the larger, fragile project of demonstrating that recovery was occurring, that the wizarding world was reassembling itself into something that could hold gatherings with string quartets and feel, if not healed, then at least ambulatory. She had arrived at 7 and stationed herself near the far wall with a glass of something sparkling that she was not drinking, and she had talked to colleagues and smiled at the right moments and kept the expression of someone who was present rather than performing presence, and she had not looked for him. She had known he would be there. The court mandate included public ministry functions, another term of the reparations program, the logic being that visible participation in post-war reconstruction served some demonstrable social function. She had known it, and she had made a decision, clean and deliberate, not to let that knowledge organize her evening around itself. She had spotted him at 7:14. He was across the atrium, near the far bank of windows that looked out over the ministry's enchanted exterior, a view of a permanent twilight sky that the Department of Mysteries maintained for reasons no one had ever fully explained. He was in conversation with a ministry official she recognized vaguely from the Law Enforcement Division, an older man with the bearing of someone accustomed to occupying important rooms. Draco was listening with the quality of attention he brought to things he was obligated to engage with, complete on the surface, entirely withheld underneath. He was wearing dark grey, not robes, a jacket cut close, very plain, with no insignia and no ornamentation except the single silver ring on his right hand that she had noticed in the stairwell's greenish light. His hair was pushed back from his face in the way it went when he had been running his hand through it, which he did, she had observed, when he was required to maintain composure through something tedious. She looked away immediately. She looked away and took a sip of the sparkling thing she was not drinking, and turned her attention to the conversation happening to her left, which was about Quidditch, and which she engaged with as earnestly as she could manage, and she was very deliberate about not tracking him across the room. The problem was that her body had developed its own tracking system, independent of conscious decision. She knew when he moved, felt it in some sub-perceptual register, the way you feel a change in the weather before you can name the specific atmospheric shift. When he crossed from the windows to the drinks table, something in her peripheral awareness adjusted. When he stopped near the string quartet for a moment, she assumed listening, though she could not look directly to confirm. The pressure behind her sternum shifted slightly in register, like a note held on an instrument, changing not in volume, but in quality. This was Stage 2's particular cruelty. The sensory erosion had been advancing quietly for days. The parchment in the archive had lost its warm yellow tone and gone ash pale to her eyes, and her morning tea tasted like heated water with ambitions. But the erosion was not even. It was selective. It did not touch everything. It left certain things with a hyper-clarity that was almost painful. The specific sound of his quill in the archive's silence, the weight of his attention when he was following her reasoning, the way the silver of his ring caught light in any room. The curse took things away and left the wrong things luminous. She understood this intellectually. She was furious about it emotionally, which she was managing by maintaining a very straight posture and talking about Quidditch with apparent sincerity. At 8:30, Ron appeared at her elbow. She was genuinely glad to see him. That was not complicated, had never been complicated, because whatever the war had rearranged between them, romantically had left intact the older and sturdier thing underneath. He was flushed from navigating the crowd and holding 2 glasses, one of which he handed her in exchange for the sparkling thing she had been not drinking. "You look like you're mentally filing something," he said, which was his way of saying she looked distracted. "I'm here," she said. "I'm present." "You're present the way a painting is present," he said, not unkindly. "Which wall are you watching?" "I'm not watching any wall." She turned to face him more directly. "How are things with the Aura program?" He accepted the deflection with the easy grace of long friendship. Ron had always been better than people gave him credit for at knowing when not to push. And they talked for 20 minutes about his training, about Harry's increasingly complicated relationship with ministry bureaucracy, about Ginny's Quidditch season, about the ordinary infrastructure of their shared life. She held it all gratefully. It felt like solid ground under feet that had been finding the footing uncertain. At 8:53, Ron glanced past her shoulder, and something in his expression changed. Not dramatically, a small tightening, the residue of things that had not been fully processed. "Malfoy's here," he said. "I know," she said. A pause. "You knew?" "It's a mandatory function for the reparations program participants," she said. "It's a matter of public record." Ron was quiet for a moment, in the particular way he was quiet when he was deciding whether to say something. "You're in the same archive as him?" "We work in the same space, yes." "Is that—" Another pause. "Is it all right?" She looked at her old friend. at his honest, open face and the genuine concern in it, the uncomplicated care that had been a feature of her life for so long, she sometimes forgot to notice it as the remarkable thing it was. "It's fine," she said. "It's professional. We work." Ron nodded, not entirely satisfied but willing to accept the surface. "If he gives you any trouble." "He won't," she said, simply, with a certainty she had not planned. Ron looked at her for a beat longer than usual. Then he smiled, and it was the smile of someone choosing to believe what they're told, which was its own kind of gift. "Right then," he said, "I'm going to find Harry before he accidentally agrees to chair another committee." He squeezed her arm as he left, warm, brief, uncomplicated, and moved off into the crowd. She stood alone by the wall. Across the atrium, she felt rather than saw him look at her. She counted 4 seconds before she allowed herself to glance in his direction. He was standing near the edge of the gathering, separate from the nearest cluster of people by several meters, holding a glass with 2 fingers around its stem in the way of someone who has no intention of drinking it. He was not looking at the crowd. He was looking at her. When their eyes met, neither of them looked away immediately. This was new. The protocol had required looking away, immediate, reflexive, the kind of visual avoidance that becomes muscle memory after enough repetition. But they were not in the archive. The protocol's geography did not quite map onto this room. This light, this specific arrangement of people and distance and string quartet playing something that wanted to be romantically atmospheric and was succeeding despite the occasion's bureaucratic trappings. He looked at her across the atrium, and she looked back, and the distance between them, 30 feet, 40, more, did nothing whatsoever to the thing it was supposed to interrupt. His expression was not warm. She did not expect warmth from him, had stopped expecting it, had begun to understand that what he offered instead was something that required more careful reading, but was not lesser, the fractional loosening of his carefully maintained surface, the quality of attention that was not performed, the way he occasionally tracked her reasoning with his eyes in the archive before he said anything, a silent half-second of recognition that she had begun to feel more than most people's expressed enthusiasm. She saw him register something, her face doing something she hadn't intended, some micro-expression she hadn't managed to suppress. His jaw shifted. His fingers moved slightly on the glass stem. She looked away first, down at her own drink, at the bubbles moving through it, at the way the enchanted atrium light caught the liquid and made it briefly golden before the gold went grey, in the way that everything went grey now at the edges. The colours were going. She had not told anyone. The string quartet shifted into something slower, and around her the atrium's noise continued, and she stood very still at the edge of it all, with the grey creeping in at the periphery of everything, and one point of absolute involuntary luminescence in the form of a man across the room who she was not watching. She thought about her theory, about suppression as mechanism, about the file's wrong conclusion and the 4 case histories, and what it meant that every strategy they had employed had been precisely calibrated to make things worse. She had more now than she'd had in the stairwell. 4 more days of research, 2 additional reference texts she'd found in the archive's lower level, a line of reasoning that was almost complete, but had one gap in it still, one piece she had not yet located. She needed the complete original documentation of the curse's creation. The file in the archive was a copy. She had understood this from the beginning. Too clean, too uniform, the kind of parchment quality that indicated reproduction rather than original. The original documentation was somewhere else in the ministry, in a section she did not have clearance to access alone. She would need help. She would need, specifically, someone with a different set of access permissions. Someone whose court-mandated ministry work had brought them into contact with sections of the restricted registry that her own department classification didn't reach. She knew exactly who that was. She looked up. He was still there, at the edge of the gathering. He had not moved, had not been absorbed into any conversational cluster, stood in his self-contained way, like someone who has made peace with being slightly outside every room he enters, and his eyes were not on her now. They were on the middle distance, on something that wasn't there, with an expression she recognized from the stairwell's greenish light. He was tired, not physically, or not only physically. Tired in the deeper way, the way that accumulates from months of managing something enormous with insufficient resources and no one to share the weight of it. She set down her glass on the nearest surface. She crossed the atrium. She did not rush, and she did not hesitate, and she kept her face in the expression of someone conducting a professional conversation, rather than walking toward the only point of colour in a room that had been slowly losing its saturation. And she stopped beside him and stood with her back to the same wall and looked out at the function rather than at him. "I need access to the original curse documentation," she said quietly, beneath the cover of the music and the crowd noise. "The file in the archive is a copy. The original is in the restricted registry, section 7, sub-level 9. A pause. She felt him recalibrate, felt the shift from wherever his thoughts had been to the present moment, to her voice, to the thing she was asking. "I have access," he said. "I know." "Monday," he said. "Monday," she agreed. They stood at the edge of the restoration gala, 2 feet apart, watching a room full of people perform recovery, and the string quartet played its slow and serious music, and the enchanted lights made everything golden except at the very edges where the gold had begun to grey. And she stood in the specific warmth of his proximity and felt, with absolute clarity, that she was not going to be able to maintain the protocol much longer. Not because it was failing, because she was beginning to understand that it had never been the right answer. The piece she needed for her theory, the gap in the logic, the missing mechanism, was not in any file. She had been looking in the wrong place entirely. She understood this suddenly, completely, the way the best understandings arrived, not built brick by brick, but present all at once, as if it had been waiting for her to be still enough to see it. She kept her face neutral. She kept her eyes on the middle distance, and her heart, behind her sternum, pressed outward with the steady, patient insistence of something that had been trying to tell her the truth for a very long time. He wrote the letter at 2 in the morning. Not because he had decided to. He had not decided anything. Decision implied a moment of deliberate choice, a weighing of options, a conscious selection between alternatives. What happened was closer to the opposite. He had been sitting at the bare table in his ministry room with a case file open in front of him that he had not been reading for 40 minutes. And then he had closed it. And then his hand had reached for a sheet of parchment with the autonomy of something that had stopped waiting for permission. And then he was writing. He wrote the way he did most things that mattered, without preamble, without warmth in the opening, without any of the conventional scaffolding that letters usually employed to ease both writer and reader into the thing being said. He had never been able to approach difficult truths obliquely. It was one of the qualities his father had tried to train out of him for years, calling it a liability. And his father had been right in the specific sense that directness, when you had things to hide, was a structural weakness. He no longer had things to hide, or rather, he had one thing, enormous and specific, and he was writing it down at 2 in the morning in a room with no one in it, which was the only condition under which writing it felt survivable. "I notice things about you that I have no right to notice," he wrote. "The specific order in which you close your files at the end of the day. The fact that you always uncap your inkwell before you've decided what to write, as though the decision is made in the motion rather than before it. The way the line between your brows appears when something in a file contradicts your existing theory. Not frustrated exactly. Recalibrating. I know the difference because I have watched you do it enough times that I have learned your face's vocabulary against my will and cannot unlearn it." He stopped. Read it back. The candle on the table had burned down an inch since he started, and the wax had pooled in its tray in a specific shape that he noted without meaning to. The way his mind catalogued things now, involuntarily, building its relentless inventory of a world that was quietly losing its color. The tea on the table was cold. He had no idea if it had ever been warm. He had made it at midnight by rote, the mechanical motion of someone performing self-care without believing in it, and he had not tasted it because there was nothing to taste. 11 days now at stage 2. The sensory erosion had the quality of something patient. It did not arrive in a rush, did not make its presence dramatic. It simply took, quietly and consistently, the way water takes stone. Yesterday, the sky over London had looked the colour of old ash. This morning, the files on his desk had been various shades of the same grey, the only things that retained their full register, and he hated this with a feeling that was itself notable precisely because it had not been eroded, were the things associated with her. Her ink, which was a deep and specific blue. The amber of the archive's candlelight, which was where she worked. The colour of her eyes, which he had looked at directly only a handful of times, but which had installed themselves in his memory with the permanence of things that intend to stay. He bent back to the parchment. "I have been trying," he wrote, "to determine at what point this became what it is. I have audited the timeline with the same methodology I would apply to any problem requiring a fixed origin point, and I cannot find one. There is no single moment I can identify as the beginning. There is only the accumulating weight of proximity, the archive's particular silence, the cold tea, the blue ink, and the realization, arriving not as an event, but as a condition, that I had been building something without noticing the construction. This is not an explanation. I understand the mechanism of what is happening to us better than the ministry does. You are close to understanding it completely, and when you do, you will find that I already knew the thing you are about to conclude. I have known it for 3 weeks. I did not tell you because telling you requires telling you everything, and I am writing this letter instead of telling you because this letter will not exist by morning. He set the quill down, pressed 2 fingers against his sternum, where the pressure had become so habitual that its absence would have felt more alarming than its presence. It had changed in character over the past week, less like pressure now, more like resonance, like a string held taut and vibrating at a frequency just below the threshold of hearing. He picked the quill up. "The thing I have known for 3 weeks," he wrote, and his hand was very steady, steadier than he felt, "is the same thing you have been working toward from the other direction. The suppression is not the countermeasure. It never was. The curse does not respond to the feeling. It responds to the shape we make when we refuse to acknowledge it, the specific architecture of wanting something, and spending every available resource constructing the appearance of not wanting it. We have been building that architecture together very carefully for months. I have been a dedicated and meticulous participant in our own deterioration. I think about the stairwell. I think about it with a frequency I would find embarrassing if embarrassment were currently available to me. But the sensory erosion has been taking things in a specific order, and embarrassment went early. I think about the particular quality of that 2 hours. The greenish light, the cold stone, the way you sat on the step above me and did not touch me and did not leave, and how those 2 facts together constituted something I did not have language for and still do not. I think about what you said about the activation mechanism and the way you said it, not with the performance of intelligence, but with the sound of a mind finding the shape of something real. I think about you across the atrium and the way you looked at me for 4 seconds before you looked away, and the way those 4 seconds contained more than most conversations. I think about this constantly, and I cannot stop thinking about it, and I am not going to send this letter." He sat back. The candle guttered in a draught from somewhere, and the shadows in the room moved and then resettled. London outside the window was doing its 4 a.m. things. Quiet, grey, distant. The sky had the flat and textureless quality that his vision gave everything now. A sky-coloured sky. A night that was simply dark rather than the specific layered darkness that night used to be. He read what he had written. He should destroy it. That had been the plan from the first word. Write it, destroy it, function. The letter was not for her. It was for him, for the pressure of all the unacknowledged things that had been building without outlet, the words that the protocol did not permit, and that were finding their way out anyway through the path of least resistance. Parchment, ink, fire. He reached for his wand. He did not cast the spell. He sat with his wand in his hand, and the letter on the table, and the cold tea beside it, and looked at what he had written for a long time. Long enough for the candle to burn down another half-inch. Long enough for the sky outside to begin its almost imperceptible shift from deep dark to the slightly less deep dark that preceded London's dawn. "I am going to tell you," he wrote finally at the bottom of the page, beneath everything else. "Not in this letter. But I am going to find the way to say it, because I have read the case histories, and I understand what continuing like this costs. And because the 4 people in those files died following a strategy that was wrong, And I have spent enough of my life following strategies that were wrong, because the people around me were certain about them. You are going to find the counter mechanism. I know this with the same certainty I know the color of your ink, which is to say, with the kind of certainty that has stopped feeling like belief and started feeling like fact. When you find it, I will tell you what I have written here. Not like this. Not with parchment between us, not with the option of fire. Out loud, in the same room, if you'll let me. He set the quill down. He read it once more, the whole of it, from the beginning. The careful notation of observed details, the architectural analysis of his own deterioration, the confession that lived at the bottom of the page without the word confession anywhere in it. Then he folded it. He held the folded parchment in both hands for a moment, feeling its weight, which was slight and enormous simultaneously, and then he stood up and went to the window and looked out at grey London and breathed through his nose twice and cast the incendiary charm. The letter burned with a small, clean flame. No smoke, just the brief warmth of it against his fingers, and then ash, and then nothing. He stood at the window. At 4:30 he pulled on his coat and left his ministry room and walked out into the pre-dawn street, because the room felt too small for what was still in it even after the letter was gone. The air outside was cold, the specific cold of very early morning in November, with a bite that cut through cloth and registered even on skin that had been losing its sensitivity. He walked without direction and ended up, as he seemed to keep ending up, outside the ministry building, its mundane muggle exterior giving no indication of what it contained below, the archive and its files, and the desk at the far end that was not his. The rain started at 4:45. He had not brought an umbrella. He stood on the ministry steps in the rain and let it happen, because the cold of it was real and registered fully, and he was greedy for that kind of realness lately, and he turned his face up slightly and felt the specific percussion of it and thought, this is still here, this still works, this I can still feel. He heard footsteps. He turned. She was on the steps below him, 3 steps down, and she was wet. Already wet, not newly arrived, but having been out in the rain for some time, her hair darkened with it, her outer robes damp across the shoulders. She was carrying a file. Of course she was carrying a file. She had been crying. He could tell because the rain was not enough to explain the particular brightness of her eyes, and because she was holding the file with both hands across her chest, in the way she held her arms when she needed something to hold, and because he had memorized her face's vocabulary without intending to, and he knew the difference between rain and the other thing. He did not mention it. She looked up at him on the steps, and her face did something complicated. Surprise, and then something past surprise, and then the particular expression she wore when she was deciding how much to reveal. The original documentation, she said. Her voice was steady. It cost her something to make it steady. I found it. Not in the registry, in the lower archive. Misfiled again, like the first memo. But I found it. The rain came down between them. A cab moved through the distant street, its headlights cutting briefly through the dark. And, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. The file in her hands was getting wet, and she did not seem to notice. I was right, she said, about the mechanism, the suppression. It's not the countermeasure, it's the... "I know," he said. She stopped. The rain was loud in the silence between his words and whatever she would say next. It fell on the ministry steps and on her darkened hair and on his coat and into the amber pools of the street lights below, and he stood in it and looked at her 3 steps down and waited. Her face changed, not dramatically. She did not do drama, had no use for it. But the particular controlled expression shifted at its edges, the way ice shifts before it gives. "How long have you known?" she said. He held her gaze in the rain. "Long enough," he said, which was what he had said in the archive on the first day. And she heard the echo of it. He could see her hear it. And what moved across her face then was something he had written about at 2 in the morning on a letter that no longer existed. She was still on the step below him, wet and holding her file, and he was above her in the rain, and the space between them was the same space that had existed in every room they had shared for months, measured, deliberate, maintained with precision, and it had never felt so exactly like the wrong distance as it did right now. Her mouth opened slightly, closed. She looked at the step beneath her feet, and then back up at him, and what was in her eyes was the question she had not yet put into words, the question that was the same question he had written at the bottom of a page and burned at 4 in the morning. He took 1 step down toward her, just 1. She did not step back. That was the thing she would remember afterward. Not what was said, not the rain, not the specific quality of the light on the ministry steps at 5 in the morning. She would remember that when he came down 1 step toward her, she did not step back. Her feet, which had been carrying her away from difficult things with considerable efficiency for 8 months, simply stayed where they were. He stopped with 1 step between them, close enough that the rain falling between them felt like a measurement, the precise distance between what had been and what was becoming. And he looked at her with an expression she had no precedent for on his face, something that had been stripped of the usual architecture, standing there without its scaffolding in the cold November rain. "You should come inside," she said. "So should you," he said. Neither of them moved. The file she was holding was thoroughly wet now. She could feel the parchment softening at the edges, the ink beginning to blur, and some part of her registered this as a problem requiring action, and the rest of her was entirely unable to act on it. She was standing on a ministry step at 5 in the morning, in the rain with Draco Malfoy 1 step above her, and the original documentation of Amor Letalis dissolving gently between her hands. And the pressure behind her sternum was not pressure anymore. It had changed in register entirely, become something with more warmth in it, something that moved rather than simply pressed. "The documentation," she said. Her voice came out slightly uneven at the last syllable. She steadied it. The original mechanism, the curse's designer was explicit about something the copy omitted. The threshold that activates the fatal progression isn't emotional intensity. It's, the word used is fractura, a fracture, a specific kind of internal split between what is felt and what is permitted expression. He was listening. She could feel the quality of his attention even in the rain, that complete, withheld way he had of following something that mattered to him. "The curse doesn't kill because of love," she said. "It kills because of the specific damage done by loving something and spending every resource you have building a structure that contains it. The fracture widens with each suppression. Eventually, She stopped. The word in the original documentation was clinical, and she had been unable to read it without feeling it physically. Eventually, it becomes structural. The magical signature tears along the fracture line. Like a bone, he said quietly, stressed repeatedly at the same point. Yes. She looked up at him. The rain was in her eyes and she didn't blink it away. The 4 case histories, they all followed the ministry's recommended protocol. Maximum suppression, maximum distance. The file describes them as treatment failures. They weren't. Her voice dropped. They were compliance successes. Something moved across his face, a complex and private motion quickly stilled. And the counter mechanism, he said, is in the original document, she said. 1 paragraph. The designer. She paused, because this was the part she had been sitting with for 2 hours in the lower archive, alone on the floor with the file in her hands and her back against a shelf, understanding something that she had needed the privacy of an empty room to understand. The designer didn't expect the curse to have a cure. They built it to be self-sustaining, but they documented the one condition under which it would fail, because they wanted whoever found the documentation to understand what they had created. What condition? She held his gaze. Full acknowledgement, she said. Not action, not resolution. Acknowledgement, spoken aloud without suppression in the presence of the other person. The curse requires the fracture to sustain itself. Complete acknowledgement closes it. She breathed once, carefully. It's designed to be ironic. The only thing that defeats it is the thing it was built to punish. The rain came down steadily between them. Below the steps, the street was empty, dark, the amber of the street lights doing what the archive's candles did, making everything slightly warmer than it was, slightly more amber, slightly more like something that could be endured. He looked at her for a long time without speaking. She watched the calculation in him, watched him work through it with the thoroughness she had come to know, the way he turned things over until he understood their full weight before he spoke. He was not performing deliberation. He was actually doing it, actually standing in the rain on the ministry steps, accounting for every dimension of what she had just said. Then he said, "We need to go inside." Not here," he said. "Not on the steps. Not in the rain." Something in his voice had dropped to its quietest register. Not cold, but specific, the way he was specific about things that mattered. Somewhere that isn't. He made a small gesture with one hand that encompassed the street, the rain, the ministry's exterior face, the muggle cab that had just passed. This. She understood. She nodded. They went inside through the maintenance entrance. She had a key because she worked hours that the main entrance didn't accommodate. And the warmth of the building hit them both at once. The specific warmth of an enclosed space that has been heated all night and smells of old stone and electrical wiring, and the distant particular ozone of 1,000 overlapping enchantments. She was dripping. He was dripping. They stood in the maintenance corridor and looked at each other in the fluorescent utility lighting, which was the least flattering light either of them had ever stood in, and she found she did not care. "The archive," she said. He nodded. They took the maintenance stairs down, 3 levels, narrow and industrial, Nothing like the archive's internal stairwell with its greenish torchlight and its cold stone. These stairs were concrete and had a handrail and were deeply unromantic, and she was glad for that, glad for the plainness of the descent, because it gave her somewhere to put her attention while she assembled herself for what was coming. The archive at 5 in the morning was different from the archive at any other hour. The enchanted candles burned low. They were timed to dim at night and brighten at 7, and right now they were at their most minimal, giving the room a quality that was less amber than usual, more like the last light of something. The shelves rose in the dimness, floor to ceiling, full of their dark classified files, their documented dangers, their carefully preserved evidence of things that should not be forgotten. It smelled of old parchment and the specific dry cold of preservation spells. Her desk was at her end. His was at his. 3 months of careful geography maintained down to the angle of their chairs. She put the wet file on her desk. She unwound her outer robe and set it over the chair. She did these things with the focused attention of someone managing the approach to something that requires a steady hand. And when she had finished, she turned around and he was standing in the center of the room, not at his desk, not at his usual careful distance, just standing there, his coat dark with rain, his hair pushed back from his face, looking at her. "All right," she said. Her voice was steady. She had made it steady through an act of will that cost more than she would acknowledge. The mechanism requires acknowledgement spoken aloud, both parties, in the presence of each other. "Yes," he said. "That's..." She pressed her fingers to the edge of her desk, lightly, something to hold against. "That's the clinical requirement. I want to be clear about that. This is not... I'm not proposing this as something other than what the documentation specifies." He looked at her. "Granger," he said, "I just think we should be clear about the framing. Hermione." Her name in his mouth, her given name, in that voice. She had not heard it before, not from him, and the effect of it was disproportionate, moved through her like a change in air pressure, like the moment before a storm when everything goes still, and the stillness itself is a kind of sound. She stopped talking. "I know what you're doing," he said. He said it without cruelty, without any edge at all, which was in some ways harder to absorb than an edge would have been. "You're building a clinical framework around this so that whatever happens next has a container, so that it can be categorized as procedure rather than as..." He stopped. His jaw worked once, that small, tight motion she had catalogued months ago. "Rather than as what it is," he said. She looked at her fingers on the desk's edge, at the ink stains on her right hand, blue, permanent, the particular blue of her preferred ink, the color that had kept its saturation while everything else grayed. She looked at that for a moment. Then she looked up. "I'm frightened," she said. The words came out simpler than she had expected. She had been carrying them in various complicated forms for weeks, dressed up in research, in protocol, in the insistent forward motion of problem solving. And here they were, simple and plain and much lighter for being out. Something in him responded to this. Not visibly, nothing as readable as a visible response, but something in the quality of the room changed, some atmospheric shift, as though the admission had altered the pressure of the space between them. "I know," he said. "Do you?" She steadied herself. Are you? A pause. In the low amber of the archive's dimmed candles, she watched him make the decision. Watched him, for the first time in all their months of careful adjacency, choose not to maintain the surface. Yes, he said, simply, without the armor. She breathed. Then, we're doing this frightened, she said. He crossed the room. Not quickly. He was not a person who did significant things quickly, and this was the most significant thing. And he crossed the archive's distance between them with the same deliberate quality he brought to everything that mattered. And he stopped in front of her with less than an arm's length between them, and she could feel the cold that was still in him from the rain and the warmth that was underneath it. And she tipped her face up to look at him directly. The acknowledgement, she said very quietly. The documentation says it has to be true, not performed. I understand what true means, he said. His voice was low. She felt it in her sternum. Not the curse's pressure, something else, something underneath it. Then she stopped, started again. I'll go first. He said nothing. His eyes on hers were very still. I have been. She chose each word with the care of someone selecting something that cannot be replaced. I have been feeling something for you that began before I had any framework for it, and that I have spent 3 months treating as a problem to be solved, because treating it as anything else felt untenable. I am afraid of what it means, and what it costs, and whether it is returnable. And I am telling you this now, not only because the documentation requires it, but because... Her voice moved slightly, a fractional tremor she did not bother to suppress. Because I am tired of the fracture. I am tired of what I feel and the structure I've built around it, and I want to stop building it. The archive was very quiet. He raised his right hand, slowly, with complete deliberateness, and pressed 2 fingers to her jaw just below her ear. Just the fingertips. The silver of his ring was cold from the rain, and his fingers were warm underneath it. And the touch was so careful, so precisely calibrated, that it felt less like contact and more like punctuation, like a full stop at the end of a very long sentence. I have been watching you, he said, since before I understood what watching you meant. I have tried distance and protocol and 5 weeks of meticulous avoidance, and none of it has touched it. His thumb moved, barely against her jaw. What I feel for you is not a stage of a curse. It was there before the curse had a name. The curse only made me stop pretending it wasn't. The fracture line in her chest, which she had felt for months as pressure, as pain, as the specific ache of something held too tightly for too long, did something she had not expected. It simply stopped, not dramatically, not with any perceptible magic, no light, no sound, no physical event she could have documented in a report. It simply ceased to press, the way a sound ceases when the instrument is finally played, when the note held in the string is finally released and becomes music instead of tension. Her eyes, which she had been keeping very steady, filled. She did not blink. He looked at her, at what was in her face, which she was no longer managing, and the expression that moved across his was something she had never seen on him before and would never mistake for anything else. Something open, something that had cost him everything he had to allow, something real. His forehead came to rest against hers. Just that. Their foreheads touching in the near dark of the archive. The rain outside audible now as a distant murmur through the ministry's walls, the candles burning at their lowest amber, and between them the specific silence of two people who have finally stopped pretending. She felt him exhale. She closed her eyes. The candles burned. Not brightly. They were still in their pre-dawn diminishment, still amber and low, but they burned with a steadiness that the archive's candles had not had in weeks, a quality of light that was simply present rather than struggling. Hermione noticed this with the part of her mind that never fully stopped noticing things, the part that ran beneath every other process like a river beneath ice. She noticed it, and she did not move, because moving would mean ending this. His forehead against hers, the cold silver of his ring against her jaw, his breath warm and close. And she was not ready to end it. She was not sure she would ever be ready to end it. The grey was gone. That was the thing she became aware of gradually, as her closed eyes adjusted to the specific darkness behind them and the specific warmth in front of her. The grey that had been advancing for weeks, taking the yellow from parchment, the complexity from tea, the blue from the sky over London, was simply absent. She could feel its absence the way you feel the absence of a sound you had grown so accustomed to that you had stopped registering it as sound, only noticing it when it stopped. The archive smelled of old parchment again. Not grey parchment, not ash parchment, but the real thing, warm and faintly sweet with preservation charms and the particular organic complexity of old paper and dried ink. She opened her eyes. His were already open. This close, the grey of them was not a single colour. It had never been a single colour. She had known this for months, had filed it in the place she put things she found unexpectedly significant. And in the archive's low amber, they held a warmth she had not seen in them before, something that the steady maintenance of his surface had been keeping back the way a dam keeps water. And the water was here now, present and quiet and considerable. She stepped back one small step, just enough to see his face fully. The ring left a faint, cold trace against her jaw where his hand had been. She was aware of this with complete, detailed precision. The specific map of the contact, its temperature, its exact coordinates. Her senses had returned with an intensity that was almost too much. The archive was full of colour and texture and scent, and the distant sound of rain, and she stood in the middle of it and felt it all arriving like light through a window that had been shuttered for months. "It's gone," she said. Her voice was quiet, slightly unsteady, and she did not repair the unsteadiness. The pressure, the grey. She pressed her fingers to her sternum, lightly, checking for the familiar weight of it. Nothing. The absence was so complete, it had its own quality. "Can you?" "Yes," he said. He had not stepped back. He was still close, still inside the distance that the protocol had forbidden for months, and he showed no inclination to observe the protocol's geography now. His voice had a texture she had not heard in it before. Not warmth exactly, but the absence of deliberate cool, which in him amounted to the same thing. "Since," he paused, "since the moment you said it." She absorbed this. The curse, whose mechanism she now understood with the complete precision of something she had reconstructed piece by painstaking piece, had not waited for ceremony. It had not required resolution or conclusion or any of the narrative architecture that human beings layered over significant moments. It had required truth, simply spoken in the right presence. And truth had been spoken, and it had been enough, and the fracture was closed. She thought about the 4 case histories. She thought about them the way she sometimes thought about things she could not change, but could not stop examining, with a grief that was clean and specific, that did not require expression to be real. 4 people who had followed wrong instructions with perfect fidelity. 4 people who had suppressed and distanced and maintained protocol and died from the effort of it. She would write a full report. She would document everything. The original mechanism, the copy's omissions, the ministry's procedural failure, the counter-mechanism that was not a counter-mechanism at all, but simply the cessation of damage. She would make it thorough and irrefutable and submit it with the kind of documentation that could not be filed away or misfiled or buried under a burn charm in a restricted drawer. She would do this because it was what she did, because it was what she was built for, because if there were other cases, and there might be, the curse's artifact had shattered in a castle full of hundreds of people, and they had not identified everyone who might have been affected. Then the correct information needed to exist somewhere that people could find it. She would do all of that later. "I owe you something," he said. She looked at him. "What?" "An apology." He said it with the same directness he brought to everything true. No preamble, no qualification, no performance of remorse designed to manage the recipient's response. Not for what just happened, for the years before it. His jaw tightened once. "For what I said to you, what I called you, the specific pleasure I took in making your existence difficult when we were children, and the specific ways I made it worse as we got older." He held her gaze. "I know an apology doesn't adjust the ledger. I'm not offering it as adjustment. I'm offering it because you should have had it a long time ago, and I was too much of a coward to give it." The archive was quiet around them. Old parchment, preservation charms, the distant rain. She considered him, really considered him, with the full attention she usually applied to complex problems, which he was and had always been, though not in the way she had once thought. She thought about 17 and cruel, and the specific texture of the words he had used, which she had put away in a place she did not often visit, because visiting it served no constructive purpose. She thought about the person who had read a classified file in 40 seconds and spent 5 weeks trying to protect her from information that frightened him. She thought about a stairwell and greenish light, and someone managing something enormous alone, because alone was the only thing available. People were not fixed things. She had always believed this. It was, in a way, the foundational premise of everything she had ever argued about post-war justice and reparations and the possibility of change. She believed it abstractly, politically, philosophically. She found, standing in the archive at 5 a.m, with the grey gone from everything, and this man in front of her, that she believed it personally. "I know," she said, "that it was a long time ago." She paused. "I know you were different. I know I was different. I know the war changed." She searched for the right word and discarded several before settling on the one that fit. "Everything," she breathed. "I'm not holding the archive of it against the person standing here." Something crossed his face. Not relief. He was too controlled for anything as expressive as relief, but a very slight loosening at the edges. the specific relaxation of something that had been held tightly for longer than was comfortable. "That's more than I deserve," he said. "Probably," she said, "but I'm not interested in what you deserve. I'm interested in what's true." She held his gaze steadily. "And what's true is that you sat in a stairwell with a fever for 90 minutes, and the first thing you did when I found you was tell me to go, because you didn't want to burden me with the evidence of it. And what's true is that you read a classified file and spent 5 weeks trying to manage the consequences alone without telling me, because telling me would have required admitting something you weren't ready to admit." She took a breath. "Those aren't the actions of the person I knew at school." He said nothing for a moment. The ring on his hand caught the amber light. "No," he said quietly. "They're not." "Good," she said. "Then we agree on something." The corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile, not quite, but the structural suggestion of one, the shape a smile would take if it were not being carefully rationed. She had never seen this expression on him before, and she found she wanted to catalogue it in the same involuntary way she had catalogued everything else, file it in the place she put things she intended to keep. "We agree on more than something," he said. "We've been agreeing on the central thing for months. We were just calling it by another name." "We were calling it a problem," she said. "Yes." "It's not a problem," she said. "No," he said. "It's not." The rain outside had softened. She could hear it through the ministry's walls as a gentler sound now, less insistent, the difference between a storm and the quiet that follows one. The enchanted candles had begun their slow brightening, so gradual it was more sensed than seen, the amber deepening slightly toward the gold they would reach by 7. It was not yet 6. The building was still empty, still in its pre-population stillness, still theirs in the way that early morning spaces belong to the people who find their way into them. She became aware, gradually, that they had been standing at close range for a considerable time now, that the distance the protocol had maintained for months had been comprehensively abandoned, and that neither of them had moved to re-establish it, and that this was the most natural thing. That was the word that came to her. Not passionate, not dramatic, but natural. The most natural thing that had happened in this room in all the months she had been in it. She looked at his face, the sharp angles of it, the grey eyes with their warmer undertone, the slight exhaustion around them that 11 days of stage 2 had left its mark on. All of it familiar now, catalogued into the comprehensive and involuntary inventory she had been building since the first Wednesday he had turned from his file and seen her standing in the archive door. She had one more true thing to say. "I don't want to maintain a distance anymore," she said. "Not the professional kind, or the protocol kind, or the kind we invented because we didn't know what else to do with this." She held his gaze. "I want..." The word required steadiness, and she gave it steadiness. "I want to find out what this is when we stop treating it as something to be managed." He looked at her for a long moment. In the quiet, in the returning colour of the archive, the amber light and the warm parchment, and the specific blue of her ink on the desk behind her. Then he lifted his hand and pressed his fingers to her jaw again. The same place, the same deliberate care, the silver ring cool and the skin beneath it warm. and he tilted her face up by the smallest degree, and he looked at her with the surface fully down, everything behind it present and visible and real. "Then stop," he said. His voice was very quiet, managing it. She reached up and covered his hand with hers. His fingers stilled under her touch. She felt him breathe. Then she rose onto her toes and closed the last of the distance herself, because she had always preferred to move toward things rather than wait for them to arrive, because the protocol was finished and the fracture was closed and the grey was gone and she was done with architecture. And she kissed him. It was not dramatic. It was not the kiss of a narrative climax or the punctuation of a resolution. It was quiet and warm and slightly cold from the rain still, and it lasted long enough to be unambiguous. And his hand moved from her jaw to her hair, and her fingers curled into the front of his still damp coat, and the archive's candles burned gold around them in the early morning. When she pulled back, they were both very still. His eyes opened. The grey of them, in the full gold light of the candles reaching their morning brightness, held every shade she had ever catalogued in the months of her involuntary inventory. And she looked at them directly and did not look away. "The report I'm writing," she said after a moment. Her voice was slightly uneven, and she did not repair it. "For the ministry, about the curse and the mechanism and the procedural failure." She paused. "I'm going to need someone with archive access to the original case files to corroborate the documentation." His mouth curved, fully this time, a real smile, unhurried, unguarded, arriving on his face with the specific quality of something that had not been permitted out in a long time. "I'm available," he said. "You have a mandatory schedule," she said. "I'll rearrange it." "The ministry won't." "Hermione," he said. She stopped. "All right," she said. Outside, the rain had stopped. Somewhere above them, London was beginning its morning, the ordinary, indifferent, magnificent machinery of a city resuming. And the ministry building would fill by 7 with footsteps and lifted voices and the specific bureaucratic noise of an institution that had not paused for the last several hours of what had been happening in its basement. None of that had started yet. Right now, there was only the archive and the gold light, and the smell of old parchment returned to its full warm complexity, and 2 people standing in the center of it with their hands still holding, his in her hair, hers in his coat, not moving toward anything, not moving away, simply standing in the same room and breathing the same air, and finding that this, which they had spent so long treating as the danger, was the only place either of them had felt fully present in months. She leaned her head against his shoulder. His chin came to rest against her hair. The candles burned steadily. The archive held its breath around them, all its dark classified files, its documented dangers, its carefully preserved evidence of things that should not be forgotten. And add this to its keeping. 2 people still standing, which, given everything they had carried and everything they had survived and everything they had finally, painstakingly allowed themselves to say out loud, was not a small thing. It was, in fact, extraordinary.
You just heard a story about 2 people who were afraid to feel, and honestly, I get that. We all do that sometimes. We feel something big, something scary, and instead of saying it out loud, we build walls, we make rules, We call it protection, but this story asks a simple question. What if the wall is a danger? What if hiding the feeling is exactly what hurts you? Draco and Hermione didn't lose each other because of curse. They almost lost each other because of silence, because of distance, because of all the things they felt but refused to say. Sound familiar? I think we all been in that acture, sitting at opposite ends of the room, pretending we don't notice, pretending we don't feel. And the truth is, the cure was never distance. It was always just honestly, simple, terrifying, human honestly. Say the true thing out loud, without armor. That's it. That's the whole story. If this reaches something in you, you know what to do. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And maybe, just maybe, say the thing you've been holding back. It's worth it. I promise.